Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
It's that time again when tales of ghosts hang in the air. After all, Halloween is just around the corner. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. The Delmarva Peninsula is filled with stories about apparitions seen in the dead of night or just the creak of the door that brings a chill to the bone. Mindie Burgoyne has compiled some of those stories in her book, Haunted Lower Eastern Shore, Spirits of Somerset, Wicomico, and Worcester Counties. She also has a company that conducts ghost tours for those who would like a first-hand look. And we have her in the studio this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So what inspired you to write a book like this, and how did you get into this idea of ghost stories?
Well, I've written 4 books on the Eastern Shore ghosts. Haunted Lower Eastern Shore was the most recent. So what started me was the first book, which was Haunted Eastern Shore, published in 2009 by the same company, History Press. And I work for the state of Maryland during the day, and what part of my job is working with municipalities throughout the Eastern Shore. So I got to know a lot of the landscapes and a lot of the people, and I started collecting these little ghost stories. And I'd already written a couple. I've been a writer a long time, and I got approached by History Press to write a book, and I pitched a haunted series for the Eastern Shore, and they took it, and it was very popular. It was that book has sold over 10,000 copies. It's a great little staple, and it continues to sell well. So then I pitched a 3-book deal to do the Mid-Shore, the Lower Shore, and Ocean City and Berlin, and wrote a book a year while I created a ghost tour company and worked full time. So it was a lot those 3 years. But I only created the ghost tour company because people were reading the books, and on social media, they were saying, "Do you do tours? Do you do tours?" And I never had done that. And finally, I thought maybe I ought to try this, and I wrote a walk for Cambridge. Cambridge was the easiest one. And then every month after that, I wrote another one until I had 10. And then the next year, I hired guides and launched the company, and it's been 8 years.
What is it like to go on one of these ghost stories in terms of their...
Well, we're not, it's easier to say what it's not like, because there's 2 perceptions out there when people say, I want to go on a ghost tour. And one is they want an experience similar to what you see on TV with the paranormal, people investigating and conjuring and calling out. And that is not what we do. Although we have a product like that. We do have a product where people can buy tickets and see that happen and participate in it. But the ghost tour walks are about 2 hours long, and we go maybe 7 to 9 properties in a 1-mile loop usually. And we talk about paranormal events, supernatural events, legends, folklore about certain properties as we walk through. Most of the information that I gathered came from here, from Salisbury University, from the NAB Center. They have a vast folklore collection. And so I photocopied everything they had. Took me about 6 months on haunted stuff so that I could take it home and then go through it and look and see how it might fit together in a book, and then later on into the tour. So then I went through personal interviews and books and old newspaper articles just to find, and it's not easy to find, 7 to 9 real, properties in an area you can walk to that have tales attached to them. And sometimes we just don't do a tour. Oxford's a good example. I'd love to do Oxford, but I don't have the properties. We just don't have a walking capability, but we do in the other 10 towns. So you walk along, you learn a little about the history, and you learn about the mystery, and it's entertainment. It's really more of an entertaining experience than it is a paranormal hunt.
Well, I have to ask you, you believe in ghosts?
Of course I do. What started was in fact, on that book you just mentioned, Haunted Lower Eastern Shore, that's my house on the cover. Although I've since sold it. I moved last year, but we lived there for 20 years. And when we moved in, we came from the Western Shore, and it's an old Victorian, and it had these things happening. And of course we didn't think it was good. I don't even think we ever even talked about whether we believed in ghosts. But we believed something was amiss there. And it's one thing for one person to experience something, but when 4 or 5 people do, it's almost terrifying sometimes. So that got me started in looking further. And yes, I certainly do believe that there's I don't know if you want to label it ghosts. I think there's another dimension, another existence, and I think sometimes the 2 dimensions collide, and we experience something, and maybe we can't even explain it, but there's something there.
You mentioned your house. What kind of things you did did you notice?
Well, it started out it started out the way most people start out, and that's sounds. That's the most common way to experience anything is sounds. It's, that's what you always hear. I heard someone call my name. I heard footsteps. I heard this crash. And that's what we heard. We heard big, loud noises that did not have any source. Windows going up and down. These old sash windows, that were hard for us to raise, we'd find one open with no screen. In Somerset County, you would never open a window with no screen, not any time of the year.
Right.
So it was an air conditioning window is why it had no screen. That was one of them. The chandelier started to move. Then it got to be more impactful, not just sounds, but over a course of about 9 months, we had a chandelier moving by itself, with such force that one of the globes fell off of it. And we had sounds of crashing upstairs that woke up my deaf husband, all four of us hearing that. I mean, the sound of somebody walking into the room, you can hear the movement of their body and their clothes, and then you find out there's no one there and the other people in the house have been in bed. That happened to many of us. Our grown children would not spend the night in our house if we weren't there. Like, we live near the beach. We'd say, come and stay. I said, no, thanks. We not sleeping there. None of my children liked that house or ever liked being in it. We loved it because eventually we got over it. But anyway, somebody else's excitement now.
Did you warn them about it?
Oh, they knew about it before
okay.
they came. In fact, they came to see the house on Halloween. It happened to be October 31st last year that was the appointment they set to come and see the house. So, yeah, they're very happy there.
Now, by the way, speaking of personal experiences, one of the things you talk about in your book is the Marva Theater in Pocomoke City. Tell me a little bit about the history there and your own personal experience.
Well, the Marva Theater was, I guess it was built in the 20s, right around there. And the interesting thing about the Marva Theater, a lot of people don't know, is 2 people died right there, one on stage and one out front. And they were both real significant people in the town. I think both of them had been mayors. I know Kurt was the former mayor. He died on stage. He was giving an award. It was an award ceremony, and he was on stage, and he looked up and then just fell backwards, and that was the end. He passed away. And then the other person who was the original owner of the theater, he died right out front, according to the councilman that I interviewed. And so the people, the theater company, they have a lot of things happen in there that it's very strange. And they'll say, we don't believe in ghosts. Well, not the young ones, but the older ones. We don't believe in ghosts, but here's what happened. I was just had the ghost tour down there, and the president of the board was there, and he let us in, and he told everybody. He said, we've locked up, and we're standing in the concession stand, and we hear footsteps up in the balcony. I mean, I heard them, and then I go up there, and there's nobody there. And that happens frequently. And the toilets flushing. They have these automatic toilets that that flush, and the girls that come in to sell the concessions, they lock the door, and they're setting things up for the night for the movie, and they'll hear that all of a sudden, in the restrooms, the toilets will flush and then flush. So something's setting off the motion there. There's been full-blown apparitions. I mean, one of them saw a child in when the theater was closed, in the theater that vanished. And what happened with me was I was in there getting ready my granddaughters were in theater camp, and there was their show that night. And so I was standing at the ticket stand inside the theater against this brass bar, talking to my husband and my granddaughter's mother, my daughter-in-law. And I had a backpack on my shoulder with my camera equipment in it. I was the first one in line, and I felt someone pushed behind me and knocked my backpack off my shoulder, like trying to get past. And so I turned around, and there was no one there. And I mean, there's not 10 inches of room anyway if one person is on that side of the bar. And so I asked my husband and my daughter-in-law, what was that? Who was that? And they were like, yeah, we saw you move, but there was no. But at the time when they were saying there was no one there, I could still feel the impression on my back of somebody pushing against me. So that was the first and only time I've ever experienced something where I was touched, actually, a physical. So it did make me a little worried. It's such a beautiful theater, and it's so historic and so well restored. And who would think little Pocomoke could raise $1 million to put that theater back the way it was? It's such a great asset to the community. But if you sit in it all by yourself and you just You will start to feel it. I promise. There isn't anybody that could sit in that theater by themselves and just stare at the stage for 5 minutes without feeling this overwhelming sense of there's something else there. And that's my...
The other actually famous building we have here in Salisbury is Poplar Mansion. And I've actually been in there a number of times. Did not see any apparitions, I must admit, but there were a lot of other people there at the time. I was there. Tell me a little bit about its history. I guess there's even an apparition of a slave, I think, at one point.
There is somebody that was enslaved. There's a lot of little things that happen at Poplar Hill, and most of them have, I think, occurred during paranormal investigations. They've done a lot of paranormal investigations there. So, I mean, the history, and I am not the expert on the history of Poplar Hill Mansion, but because there are like 300 different stories I have written up, so I can't always pull the dates out. But this I do know. It was built by Dr. Houston, and he had several daughters, and he did enslave people. And there was a room upstairs that they believe was a nursery, and the enslaved woman that was taken, and I think her name was Sarah, actually. I think just like the curator there. Her dress caught fire, and burned her to death. Now, some people say it was that her dress, sort of went against the fireplace, and others say she was pushed into the fireplace, but nobody really knows that. No, we do know that there was a fire there, and a young enslaved woman died. And what people really don't know is back in the 19th century, the most common way for women to die was, of course, childbirth. But the second most common way that women died was fire, because they wore cotton dresses and they cooked over open flames. And it was not that uncommon to have that happen, that terrible tragedy. So there's many people that think when you have a high injection of human emotion, like a battle or a murder, a suicide, accidental death, it just kind of creates this hole between the dimensions. Like if you've been to the Gettysburg battlefield, for example, almost everybody feels something there. 15,000 people, just sort of massacred there. So on a smaller scale, something like Poplar Hill, where you have a terrible thing like that happen in a room, and then you have these sort of repeat unexplained events. One of the things I've heard happens there is the sound of sweeping, on the steps. People will hear what sounds like a broom sweeping, or noises coming from that room, or they have it set up like a nursery, or the toys and the chairs turned around, at different places. So I know that they felt cold temperature drops, especially near that piano. It's not a piano, it's pianoforte. I think it's an antique instrument. People have sat down on that and felt this rush of cold air come up their back. So these holes in the dimension seems to be pretty prevalent there. Even Sarah, the curator there, who will say, I don't believe in ghosts, she'll tell you, but these weird things do really happen. And I do sometimes feel like there's a presence there.
The other building, by the way, I was curious about the Gray Eagle, which is a jailhouse, and it actually the sign a place where George Orwell was pulled out and lynched. In fact, I went down to see some of it. Tell me a little bit about its history.
Well, it was the jail. When we had community jails, we don't really have them anymore. The jails frequently looked like houses because they were houses. You'd have the way we had it set up was we had a jailer. It might be the sheriff, it might be a deputy, and his family would live in the house. The wife would take care of the needs of the people that were incarcerated, and then the husband would all be involved in some kind of law enforcement, and their whole family would live there. And that jail has had 2 murders in it, and it used to be built of wood. And the inmates burned it down, so they set it on fire. So they brought in all the stone from Pennsylvania. It's a stone building. We don't have stone buildings here. We don't have any stone. So they decided they were going to make these walls 18-inch thick and build a jail that kept people in. And that's why you have the Gray Eagle with gray stones. But after after it was built that way, they did have an inmate murdered in there. And I don't know that story, but it was before George Armwood, which was in the 1930s. And then George Armwood was one of those terrible cases where there was an African-American man accused of a violent crime, and you had people that wanted to lynch him or do their own justice. And there's a lot, I take a half hour to tell you that whole story, but just suffice it to say, this was the end of a wave of that. The 1930s is when that started to phase out. But they did come and drag him out of there. In fact, I was able to interview the daughter who was in an assisted living home here at the very end of her life. She was in that. She was in that place as a child, and she commented to other people, as well as me, that she remembered them dragging George Armwood down those steel steps, and his head hitting every one of the steps, as it came down. It was terrifying for her. There were deputies that were injured, and I think there were 12 deputies there. They broke the door. These vigilantes broke down the door with a battering ram and dragged him out. And then did all sorts of terrible things throughout the town. It was just a terrible thing. So the Gray Eagle, I don't think they had any reports of, I couldn't find any, of haunted stuff until they renovated it. So when they went in to renovate it, back when Jay Parker was the town manager, so this is in the last 20 years, I guess, around, they went in to renovate it. The workers were experiencing things that were, footsteps that were coming up the stairs, people talking where there were no people, the windows opening and closing. In fact, Jay told me that there were so many reports that a lot of times they get workers that would come after, contractors that would come after hours and work, for the town to restore it. And they just wouldn't do that. They weren't coming at night. They weren't coming alone. And it was a thing. Jay said, this got to be a thing. And we were like, it wasn't one or two things. It was like people, we really couldn't keep people in there. So then if you went back and you asked the police officers, even as recent as 5 years ago, they've got their stories. One of probably the most common one, the one that freaked me out the most, was this officer was telling me we have a little room in there and we interview perpetrators, victims, witnesses. It's just enough. It is a table and 2 chairs. It's like a closet. And then we tape our interviews and then send them off to get transcribed. And the transcribers, every once in a while, will question who the third voice is. Is there somebody else in there? Is this background? Are they saying something? When he said you could not fit a third person in there. So there wasn't, voices picking up like that. Things like the TV coming off and on late at night. Shadows on the wall being cast when there's no person to cast them, seeing that. Real strange things going on in there. No, I will say too, that's a stop on the ghost tour. The Princess Anne ghost tour is a very, very popular ghost tour. I think we probably will do almost 200 people this season, just Princess Anne alone, tickets. They take pictures, and we have one picture that a guest took who did not believe in ghosts, by the way. She was the one, I did that tour, and she raised her hand when I said, who doesn't believe in ghosts? She was, I don't believe in ghosts. She was real, belligerent about it. And I wanted to say, why are you here? But I told him about taking pictures, take several at a time. And she stood in front of that jail and took a picture of the front of it. And then she comes to me and she says, do you see anything in here? And it's the window that's just above the door. And there is a distinct, and I don't mean, you don't have to imagine to look at it, it looks like a child's face. It right in the center bottom pane of the window, in negative, not in positive. We show it on the ghost tours, and everybody sees it immediately. And the thing is, there's no floor there. There is no floor under that window. When you walk in the door, it's a cathedral type ceiling. So there isn't any way there could have been a person there to cast it. And then we got another guest that got on one of the first ghost tours, and she took a picture in a tree, and it looks exactly like a hanged man. I mean, the feet, the shoulders, the hands, the clothes. It just is terribly disturbing, which is why we don't let children on that tour. So I finally stopped allowing children on that tour because the content's disturbing. Anyway, that's my Princess Anne stuff.
That's that. Well, let's take a look at Chrisfield, because we have the McCready Hospital and a guy named Richard Christie.
Oh, Richard Christie. That's an old ghost story. That was in the NAB Center. And, if you talk to anybody, and I got to say, there are still Christies in Chrisfield, so I'm going to say this, knowing that I've talked to them, and they have said that it was actually a grandson, that Richard Christie was a wonderful grandfather, and he was a very nice. So, but if you talk to anybody about Richard Christie, they say he was mean. He was mean. I bet 20 people said that to me that remembered him. But the story is, he did actually help a lot of businesses get started, because I went and I tried to research what he did. He was the owner of a seafood company, a big one, and he was known for being nasty. And so he had to go in to have something with his heart. Either he had a heart attack or he was going in for some kind of surgery at McCready. And they took him put him into a surgical area, according to everybody and the commentary at the NAB. And there was a man seen walking into that room who had an overcoat and a hat, and no one was supposed to be in there. And so the people at wherever they were congregating outside a nurse's station or some hospital staff started to go in there to tell the man to come out. And there was a thunderstorm outside, and there was a big crash of thunder that zapped the power just as they were doing that. And then when they went to open the door to the surgical, it was so hot no one could touch it. So they finally got the door open, and the lightning bolt had hit an air conditioner in the window in that room. And they walk in and they say, and there was the smell of sulfur as soon as we entered the room, because the devil came in. And, there's all kinds of comments at the end. But Richard Christie was killed. He was killed in that lightning strike. And so the folklore that rose around that has always been, that something came and grabbed him out. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard different versions of that. It has really become an urban legend. So the thing is that McCready Hospital, in that old part, they have so many people say that there's, stuff going on in there, things that happen, chairs rolling out of rooms. I remember somebody saying that. The old superintendent's daughter had a lot of comments about that. She used to be there when she was little, and she would see stuff, and her father would say, look, don't pay attention. Try not to pay attention. It happens all the time. He kind of dismissed it, and she that place is so haunted. But we have, people that worked there recently say that in that old part of the building, there would be sounds of talking, or almost like you're in another world. You can barely hear. I remember one person saying you can barely hear it, but if you listen closely, it sounds like a couple of people are talking down the hall. And then you go in, that place is closed at night. It's all offices now, so they close that part off, yet we can hear stuff. So for what it's worth, there's still talk of that. I will tell one last comment here. Anytime you talk to somebody that works at McCready, you can say, hey, is McCready haunted? And they'll say, oh, let me tell you, 4 out of 5 people will say, I got a story, So it's a lot of fun.
Now you also talk about, you talk about these the forests and swamps have been probably one of the eeriest things, and you have the witch's tree. Tell me a little. You have
the witch's tree fell down.
Oh, did it finally fall down?
It fell down
because I saw it in the photograph of it. Yeah.
It was something to see. It was already falling. And that was an interesting thing for me to research, because I don't know much about Delaware, and that actually I think is right over the line. But it's the same thing in the Pocomoke Forest. It depends on what generation is talking about it. So back, from the 1940s all the way up until really almost the 1990s, anything ghosty was demonic, satanic. They were witches saying the Our Father backwards in front of candles with an upside down Bible. It was just like, you find stuff like that. When obviously that probably was an exaggeration. And I think the witch's tree, the idea was that people would go there and practice witchcraft and do satanic things, and they saw animals sacrificed and all of this stuff. But I found no basis for it. I kept trying to find newspaper. I couldn't find anything. And finally I put it on our Facebook page, and somebody who lives back there and has lived there all his life messaged me a big long comment saying, you know what? I played around that tree as a kid, and it is a beautiful tree. He said maybe it does have a sort of supernatural power, but it's not bad. It's a beautiful, and we're so sick of kids coming back here and, desecrating the tree and messing up the space and trespassing. And, I wish you wouldn't promote, basically he was saying, I wish you wouldn't promote this. So I told that side of it, and did say that I couldn't find anything that really linked any supernatural activity, officially there. And then it just fell down just a year or so ago. It finally did fall down. I even asked Ronnie Haymaker, who's an arborist locally, very, well-known arborist. showed him pictures of that tree, and it had a lot of collaring around the branches. And I said, Ronnie, what's with this tree? And he said, it's the tree trying to heal itself, and it is really, really leaning way too much for it to be healthy. And then, of course, it eventually just fell over.
You also have this great story about the coasting captain and the phantom mate.
Oh, isn't that interesting? That's Leonard Tawes. Leonard Tawes lived in Crisfield, and he lived. In fact, his house is sort of falling into terrible disrepair. It's right at the end of Somerset Avenue, and he had a big schooner. He was the last operator of a non-motorized vehicle that did commerce, really, and that's why he's called the coasting captain. And he had all these journals. He kept all of these logs, and he was talking. I think the thing is he was telling these stories to his granddaughter. He retired really pretty young. Like maybe in his 50s, if I recall. But she went and had the logs put together into a kind of memoir of his life as a coasting captain. And he has one entry in there where he talks about, let me get this right. He is in Chestertown, or maybe Baltimore. He's in Baltimore. And there's a boy from Chestertown that he hires as his first mate, a Cosden. By the way, the Cosdens are so associated with another gigantic ghost story. so seeing that it's a Cosden, I'm like, wow, that's kind of synchronistic. So this boy joins him, and he writes about how they the boy gets sick as they're going into the West Indies. And as he's pulling into to this place, Demarascata, I can't remember what the name of it was. But he pulls into this place, and he has to have the boy see a doctor. And he takes the boy to the doctor, and the doctor puts the boy in bed on an upper floor, and he tells the captain he's not going to live. He's going to die. And so he writes how he had to go talk to this boy and say, I can't take you back, and you're going to die, and I'm going to send your pay to your mother. And he comments that as he walked down the stairs and took one last look at that boy, he said, I will never forget the look on his face, and I hope nobody ever has to see it. It's the most tragic thing you'll see. And so then they go and they do their job. And then they're coming back, and when they pass near that area, they hit a really big storm. And he talks about how he was trying so hard to just get that ship into a sheltered harbor so he didn't lose it, because he certainly would have lost the ship. He gets it into the harbor, and they still are having a terrible time. And he's got to sleep, so they looks like they're handling it okay, and he goes to bed, and then he gets woken up again by this terrible tossing of the sea. Can't even get to the deck. And when they finally have this all together, when he gets up on deck and he sees that they're okay, the crew's okay, and the crew says, hey, the first mate was here. If it hadn't been for him, we wouldn't have been able to get this under control. And he said, the first mate's not on here. I left him. He's not here. So he writes that in his log that he was part of the crew that was helping, and he doesn't think about it. So next time he's going down that way, he stops by and sees this doctor and asks what happened to the boy and where was he buried. And the doctor tells him the date and time of his death. And then when he goes back and references it against the log of that night, the boy died just at the time they saw him, just prior to the time. And he writes, I don't believe in ghosts, but this, in other words, freaked him out. And so he sent that to the Chestertown newspaper, the Crisfield newspaper, and the Baltimore Sun, and I'm pretty sure all three of them. If you look in the old newspaper files, you'll find the whole thing written out by him. He's buried over in the Crisfield Cemetery with his child and his wife, and he's really revered. I mean, he's, in fact, the book Coasting Captain, which was published by the Maritime Association down in some maritime association in Norfolk. It's very hard to come by. It's very expensive if you can get a copy of it, but it's a wonderful book, and they do have it in the Crisfield Library. You have to sit there and read it. You can't check it out.
Well, finally, do you have, just in a brief few minutes we have left, do you have a favorite ghost story that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, my favorite is always going to be the Snow Hill Inn. The Snow Hill Inn is the only property that I know of in Maryland on the Eastern Shore that has been featured as haunted in a national television network. It's now a private home. But it was an inn for a long time, and a restaurant after that. And I guess when Jim Washington had it, and he and his wife were operating it as an inn, like a bed and breakfast and a restaurant, there were the supernatural activity happening. And everyone said it was, the ghost's name was JJ, and he committed suicide. He was Dr. Idlet's son, and he haunted the place. And that's pretty much what everybody said. Nobody knew much more than that, but they did have a significant amount of paranormal activity experienced by a lot of people, unrelated, over a period of time. That's what blew my mind about it.
What kind of things?
Well, one of the things would be fire, things to do with fire, like candles on the table would just light themselves. They'd come on, or the fireplace would light itself. Now, it was a gas fireplace, and it would come on without anyone igniting it. Lights would flicker, lights would go off and on. A lot of intermittent electric activity. Now, Jim Washington had a full-blown apparition of seeing this boy. He said he'd never forget it. He'd seen the face of this boy, seeing the face of the boy in the mirror. There was a big mirror in the hallway. You'd go by and have another reflection, but there was no one there to cast the reflection. I even had an experience there. I went in there for lunch, and there was a bath. The public bathroom was just right off this bar area. And I went in there to turn on the light, and the light didn't come on. And so the bartender was outside, and I said, you got to fix the bulb. And he said, I just changed the bulb a couple weeks ago. So he went in and flicked the light on, and it went on. And so I flicked it off, and then I flicked it on again, and it didn't come on. And then the two of us went, wow. So he turned it off and turned it back on, and it went on. And I said, okay, I'm not going to, get out. I'm going to use this bathroom now, because it had no windows. You had to have a light on. That was just so weird. And but then we heard from the innkeeper, even after it changed over to a Mexican restaurant, after it was sold. She had this torment at night where she said the bed was shaking. She wakes up out of the sleep to someone shaking her bed, and just as she was coming out of the sleep, she could see somebody at the foot of the bed. There were people that got locked in the office, and I don't mean by a key. It's just they go into the office, and they wouldn't be able to open the door. They couldn't get out, and they'd bang on the door to get out, and then they'd check the door, and there was nothing wrong with the door. That happened several times. They'd say, nobody shut the door when you go in the office. And in the bedroom upstairs, there was a long bedroom in the attic area. People that were innkeepers that lived there, some young married couple, told me that they would see things, going around, lights going around at night. Definitely a sense of somebody watching you. It was terrifying to go in the basement. And so I ended up helping National Geographic Television Network on that Is It Real series, and watched that psychic medium go through and listen to what he said. And the thing is that this William Idle, I don't know where the name JJ came from. I don't know how that came about. But the boy who committed suicide was 21. His name was William, and he was Dr. Idlet's son. Dr. Idlet had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The daughter was older. Her name was Mildred. And William went to Washington College, graduated with honors, and then he went on to pharmacology school. That we know. We know that he got sick, that he was failing his classes. And in January, he was found laying on his bed in a rooming house that he was staying in for college, with his throat slashed twice, the razor under the bed, and they say they found a note, but that's erroneous. And just that the note was found in a box of things later when they went through them. And it did not say, I'm committing suicide. It said, Father, it's no use. He was failing out. He was writing a note to his father. So he probably was depressed. But Mildred, his sister, married a senator, and they had a son who was also a senator, I think, or at least a very prominent attorney in Accomack. He was interviewed many years later, and he said, the family never thought he committed suicide. It's just that today you have an EMT, a coroner, a police officer. They're all the same person. The guy showed up at the rooming house and said, yep, he's dead. He's laying on the bed. There's nobody else in here. Must be a suicide. Was he depressed? And that was a great curse to the family. Nobody ever wanted to admit they had someone commit suicide. And so it was just covered up, and he was buried. But it is probable that it wasn't, based on what, J. Walter Mapp said. I think it was his name. Mapp was their last name, the one that married Mildred, their son. Based on what he said, is we didn't think that was a suicide, and it was never investigated. So maybe there's an unrestful spirit there, and that's why it's it's the way it is.
Well, we've been speaking with Mindie Burgoyne. She's compiled a number of stories in her book, Haunted Lore Eastern Shore, Spirits of Somerset, Wicomico, and Worcester Counties. Of course, only one of many that she has written. Also has a company that conducts ghost tours for those who'd like maybe a first-hand look at some of these places. We appreciate you taking time to stop by and talk with us.
Thank you very much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.